New times need new stories, new heroes, new virtues, tied to our mythic past but looking always ahead towards the next turn of the weird. These are the gods and heroes of the modern age. This is the new mythology. One of the most frustrating things about being a Tolkien fan who loves the Rings of Power is encountering smack talk masquerading as critique from people who clearly approached the show in bad faith. It's one thing to have watched the show from a place of honest engagement and still come away not liking it. Plenty of Tolkien fans have done that. Though, oddly, most of them whom I know still recognize that the showrunners have great affection for Tolkien and know the Middle-earth lore quite deeply, despite these fans' unhappiness with the final product. It's quite another thing, however, to come into the show thinking you're smarter than the showrunners without having even a Lambus breadcrumbs worth of credentials to back up your smack talk. And, on top of that, to think that you have ferreted out the showrunners' secret agenda to fix Tolkien or unravel Western civilization or whatever. This latter attitude is frustrating not just because of its arrogance and condescension, but also because it often deprives its purveyors of the ability to understand what the show is doing at the level of its narrative construction, even when they notice it happening. This attitude gives them eyes with which they cannot see.
I just realized the whole Dutch angle thing is they did this the last time these two characters spoke to each other. That entire scene was the same thing. That's probably why they're doing it again.
There's so much unease between these characters, you see. This is filmmaking.
I can't believe that they're like, poetry. Sauron got seasoned, and then Adar got seasoned. Rhymes.
It's
and
great
both
writing.
of them, their failure
rhyme
was
so much as
the well-being of the orcs.
I mean, like, I
Okay.
guess a word does rhyme with itself, technically.
I just find it funny because it's just like, it doesn't matter how we get there. That's all that is reflected in this as a payoff, right? We don't care how we get there, just as long as we get there. And getting there and having it be the same as what happened at the beginning, that makes it good.
Yeah, you
It's
can
just
tell
they on writing.
when they were writing season 2, they clearly designed the first scene to have an inversion at the end. And then I guess they decided to try and connect the dots and just didn't really.
I detour into this silly take on the show for two reasons. First, because this is the kind of fake critique that dominates discourse around the show on YouTube, and this framing has significantly poisoned the well of all other discussion. And second, because these particular clips come so close to actually understanding how the show works and then fumble the ball because of their own narcissism and arrogance. What they noticed and then dismissed because they think they're big boy smarty pants is that the Rings of Power is not relying on standard linear narratives built around heroes' journeys. Instead, it employs a much older story structure that relies on parallels, reflections, and mirroring to convey narrative information at every level of its construction, and comprising two symmetrical halves with the conclusion returning to a new version of the beginning. And understanding how this ancient story structure works is the key to deciphering most of the things about the show that even its good faith critics find mysterious or confusing. Rings of Power is using a story template called chiastic structure, or ring composition. Despite the pun in its name, ring composition is actually a very old method of building stories. It's the one used in ancient heroic poems like Beowulf, the Iliad, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Chiastic structure is the closest thing to what Campbell's hero's journey claims to be, a near-universal template in the ancient Western world for building an engaging story. It takes its name from its shape, which resembles the Greek letter chi, which looks to us like the letter X. But it's not the letter X.
It's not an S.
A visual representation of the chiastic story shows its narrative elements converging on a central hinge point and then being reflected or paralleled in reverse order as they fan out from the central hinge point. So a chiastic story would go narrative element A, followed by narrative element B, followed by narrative element C. Then, after crossing the hinge point, it would go narrative element C prime, followed by B prime, followed by A prime, the end, with each of the primes being a reflection or a parallel of their counterparts in the first half of the story. The hinge point isn't necessarily the climax of a chiastic story. In fact, it usually isn't. That still comes towards the end, like in most stories. But the hinge is the point at which the whole narrative abruptly shifts in some way. Characters reverse major decisions, or the tone changes, or the pacing accelerates, or any number of other things. The longer the story, the more elements there are, the more complex the chiasmus gets as all the elements interact and become multiple reflections of each other, as they become rings within rings. When you map out the elements of a chiastic story as a bullet point outline, it often takes on a wedge shape that suggests one half of the letter chi. It's sometimes also called ring structure because to the audience the story can feel circular thanks to all of the reflections and returnings. Chiastic structure isn't only found in ancient literature, though. It's still employed in many modern works. Notably, J.R.R. Tolkien used the structure in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. A chiastic outline of each of those stories should be on screen right now. You can pause the video to read them or follow the links in the description to read more detailed analyses of each. Now, in what may be the best and most subtle of its many homages to Tolkien, The Rings of Power is employing chiastic structures at every level of its narrative construction too. Plot, character development, theme, lighting, cinematography, score, editing, basically everything. And this is not speculation on my part. The showrunners, Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne, publicly confirmed their use of chiasmus in an interview for the official Rings of Power podcast.
Quickly, the other thing I was going to say about that, the show starts with her brother saying, "Be careful of false light in the water." Hopefully it's also rhyming back to some of the imagery he warned her about.
And something that you'll see a lot of in the show is this sort of chiastic structuring within seasons, across seasons, within scenes, within episodes, where you have this sort of rhyme or symmetry, sort of a ring structure, where something you see in the beginning is then mirrored again at the end.
McKay and Payne have famously said that they already know what the final shot of the final episode of the final season will be. It will likely be some variation on the first shots of the first episode of the first season. And it's the chiastic structuring of the show that enables them to know this that far out from the final season. I genuinely believe that a lot of good faith critics of the show, who are more used to and therefore expecting strictly linear storytelling rising to a final crisis with a denouement built around a standard hero's journey template for its protagonists, are kind of thrown off by the show's actual structure. But once you understand how the Rings of Power is built and what it is doing, a lot of the elements that critics called out as unnecessarily mysterious, vague, or unfinished begin to make sense. Through an interwoven network of repeated narrative elements, phrases, symbols, musical progressions, camera angles, etc., that some dismiss as cheap fan service, The Rings of Power is actually building narrative cohesion across its planned 5 seasons, and reading it in its intended circular structure reveals that elements that currently feel random, disconnected, or out of place are actually ones that have just not yet received their reflection or parallel because the show's larger plot has not yet crossed its hinge point. That will likely come midway through the show's currently filming 3rd season, after which these earlier elements will begin to receive their reflections and their larger narrative purpose will come into view. There are a lot of examples I could draw from the show's text to demonstrate all of this, but I'll focus on the one that really seems to piss everybody off: the portrayals of Galadriel and Sauron. Galadriel's and Sauron's character arcs across the first 2 seasons of The Rings of Power reflect each other in a large narrative ring that's grounded in 4 elements of their backstories from Tolkien's Legendarium. Number 1, the fact that Sauron briefly but sincerely sought redemption in the Second Age, as attested in The Silmarillion and Tolkien's Letter 131. Number 2, Galadriel not noticing that her mind had been touched by the shadow, just like the rest of the Noldor, as we are told in the Shibboleth of Feanor. Number 3, the revelation in the Fellowship of the Ring that Galadriel knows the Dark Lord's mind, or all of it that concerns the elves, and that Sauron gropes ever to know hers. And number 4, the statement in the Unfinished Tales that Sauron immediately perceived that Galadriel would be his chief adversary and tried to placate her, bearing her scorn with outward patience and courtesy. Taken together, these 4 elements suggest a direct personal connection between Galadriel and Sauron at some point in their long histories, and the show uses plausible dramatic license to explore that connection. Galadriel's arc is from light into darkness, and back into light. Sauron's arc is from darkness into light, and back into darkness. This seemed rather obvious to me as I watched the show. I mean, this shot alone should have tipped people off, but as I witnessed the discourse around it during the first season, it became clear to me that a lot of people were perhaps not paying as much attention to the non-dialogue and non-action elements of the show as I assumed they would. Just paying attention to how each character is lit across both seasons, especially in their scenes together, conveys the narrative information that Galadriel begins in light, descends into darkness, and rises back into light, and vice versa for Sauron, who begins his arc usually in shadow, then rises fully into light at Season 1's hinge point, and slowly descends back into shadow across the rest of that season. Speaking of hinge points, Season 1's happens when the white tree Nimloth sheds its leaves, a sign of divine providence that causes Queen Regent Tarmiriel to change her mind about Galadriel. At this moment, and the episode that follows, Galadriel is fully in shadow, and Sauron is fully in light. And yet, each of them still bears a touch of their opposite within them. After this hinge point, we begin to see numerous reflections in the second half of the season of elements from the first half of the season. The most obvious one is that towards the beginning of episode 1, we see young Galadriel gazing upon all she is fated to lose in Valinor, while Finrod rises into the light of the 2 trees. This is mirrored by the final scene of episode 8, with Sauron gazing upon all he is fated to claim in Mordor, and then descends into the shadows of Mount Doom's eruptions. The 2 sequences are almost exact copies of each other in terms of camera angles, editing, and timing, and they convey important narrative information. They're not just there because the showrunners thought it would be clever. Galadriel's relationship to Shadow is also mirrored in reverse order on both halves of the Season 1 hinge. In Episode 1, just after the shot mentioned above, Galadriel breaks through a wall of ice in Forodwaith, opening a door that invites darkness to thrive within her. In Episode 8, just before the shots of Sauron mentioned above, she closes a door in an act of redemptive sacrifice that allows the light of humility to begin growing within her. So the sequence goes: narrative element A, Galadriel gazing upon the light; narrative element B, Galadriel opening a door to darkness; the mid-season hinge point, Nimloth shedding its leaves; narrative element B prime, Galadriel closing a door on darkness; and narrative element A prime, Sauron gazing upon the shadow. A neat, tidy little chiastic structure. The point of all of this is that both Galadriel and Sauron come full circle with new insight and choose their fates with full agency. Sauron is truly good at the zenith of his arc in Numenor. Galadriel is truly fallen at the nadir of her arc at the same point in the story. Because each of them still holds a seed of their origin within, they each have a path back to their beginning, but only if they choose it. And by the way, that's the only point of the much maligned "you must touch the darkness to know the light" line from Finrod. All that meant was that sometimes your faith and discernment must be tested for you to truly learn who you are. Sauron has a similar conversation in his Season 2 flashback. Diarmid tells Sauron that he has to keep choosing good if he wants to actually be good. Same message that Galadriel got from Finrod, but Sauron takes it in the opposite direction. It's not just Galadriel and Sauron the show does this with either. The Rings of Power is full of parallels and reflections like this. Elrond and Gil-galad trade the line, "Hope is never mere, even when it is meager." Harfoots use a bird call to signal safety in an act of self-preservation on one side of the Season 1 hinge. Then Harfoots use a bird call to invite danger in an act of self-sacrifice on the other side, and so on. I could go on for hours, but this video is already too damn long, and you should just go watch The Rings of Power on your own. Maybe using this knowledge of its chiastic structure at work will help you appreciate it as much as I do, or at least maybe help you understand elements of the show that you previously thought were too vague or too random. Thanks for watching. Before you go, please be sure to make all the proper sacrifices of likes, shares, subs, and comments to the great god algorithm. And until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.